There, I can do it. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be with you again this week, the middle of this very, very hot and dry July, at least where we are. My big rescue dog doesn't recognize it. He should be quiet right now. Okay. I am delighted today to have a conversation with our friend Kat Owens of Eat by Faith. We've had Kat speak at one of our events. I'm going to open the door. Excuse me. Okay. Not a good thing to let him out, but not a good thing for him to bark all the way through either. Okay, so there he is. Anyway, we've been friends with Kat now for a couple of years, and we're really impressed with what we do, what she does, and hopefully we'll get her to speak next April at our next event at Melvin's Farm to Fork again as well. So with no further ado, please welcome Kat Owens. Kat, welcome to our show. It's so good to have you.
Thank
Kat,
you so much, Marie.
you're welcome. The last time we saw you, actually, you were expecting your second child. And that child now is how old?
She's 6 months old now.
Okay. And everything is going just fine with her?
Yes, she's doing great.
Yeah. One of the things I think we might want to touch on at a later date maybe is fertility issues and healthy pregnancies. I know that that's something that you've got something to say about. But for today, I want to first have you tell us a little bit about what you do specifically with Eat by Faith.
Yeah, thank you. So, with what I'm doing with my business, I'm trying to help educate Christians about nutrition because, as we'll get into, I'm sure it really makes a huge difference if we talk about this with a biblical worldview in mind, because most of the information we're getting about nutrition, whether it's the conventional view or even if it's from a lot of alternative views, it is coming from a place of these anti-biblical worldviews, even a lot of influences from false religions. And when we look at all that with a Christian worldview, it really does end up changing the conclusions we come to. And those conclusions make a big difference in how what people eat affects their health.
Good. I agree totally. What brought you to the point that you began to think about these things?
Yeah, so like a lot of people in this space, it was dealing with some of my own health problems. I got out of college and I started having some blood sugar problems, digestive problems, nothing major, which I'm really grateful for. But when I went to these conventional doctors and started trying to get answers, the answers I got were, well, you're going to have to maybe carry a sugar pill around in your purse if your blood sugar gets low. Or we think your digestive problems might be anxiety, so you should try this anti-anxiety medication, which ended up being an antidepressant without even telling me. And which, of course, I didn't even fill the prescription, but I just realized really quickly that conventional medicine is focused on acute issues. And when it comes to chronic issues, they're not usually very well equipped to handle that, not with the conventional training that most doctors get. And so I figured out pretty quickly that I was going to have to do my own research on this. And the thing that drove me to that was realizing that the answers I was getting didn't make sense with my faith. That I knew God had created my body well. I knew God had made his creation well. And it didn't make sense to me that I was just fundamentally broken and there was nothing that could be done except just try to patch those things up. So when I started learning a lot about nutrition, I realized there's so much potential out there. But then I also saw that a lot of what is out there does not necessarily work with our Christian worldview. And that's why it's so important to view this differently as Christians.
I agree on all of that, and we share the same viewpoints, and I'm sure the same frustrations. We have a lot of health issues that we've encountered in our family, a few, not a lot, a few. And we've chosen to look to God's word instead of conventional medicine for the most part, although we have had to also a couple of times go to conventional medicine, sometimes for life-saving, from a life-saving aspect. But how do you feel when you're talking with friends at church, or you're someone's going through the prayer list at
Mhm.
Bible study or something, and you see all of these people with all of these health issues? Maybe some of them are the same kinds of issues that you also experienced. What do you
Yeah,
think goes through your mind?
that was another big reason that I wanted to get into this, is also to show Christians that there's so much potential in God's creation for being able to be healthier. And you're so right about the prayer list. I'm sure we've all been to prayer meetings or prayed with a small group, and so many of those prayers are health problems. And of course, we believe that God can do miracles, and we will pray for that. But a lot of times, God's healing also works through the natural order he's already created for how healing happens. And, there's a lot of reasons that Christians often don't want to talk about nutrition. They've seen that health food stores and things have been associated with just this hippie movement in the past. And it's,
Yeah.
yeah, earth worshiping hippies and animal rights activists trying to elevate animals to the same level as humans. Or they believe that, all I should be doing about this is praying about it. I think Christians can be scared about becoming legalistic, and they're worried that talking about nutrition biblically means we're going to be putting rules around food. And that's not what we're doing at all. But there's just a lot of reasons that Christians, I think, shy away from this and don't want to talk about nutrition and don't want to talk about how do we eat differently? How do we apply our faith to what we eat? And there's so much potential there if we're willing to go down that road and look at what can we take from God's word and apply it to our diet.
And in your experience, what are some of the reasons that you think Christians aren't willing to take a look?
I think it's that fear of legalism is actually a big one that I think they don't want to talk about. We don't want to make we don't want to make these moral commandments,
Right.
There's so much potential to talk about. It's kind of like Paul says when he talks about everything is lawful for me, but not everything is beneficial. We can think about food that same way. There's a big difference between talking about something that's sinful and something that's not beneficial, or something that's morally commanded versus something that's just going to help us. There's a big difference with that. I've also seen Christians that they have a goal like weight loss or something, and they just think, if I start trying to follow some fad diet or something, that's not me putting my faith in God. That's me looking to these worldly things like I'm going to do a diet. And so they think I just need to pray harder and try harder with God's power. But what those people don't realize is that what they're probably trying to do is just eat less calories because they think that's the way to do it. But that's a fad diet. And it doesn't mean that there's any value in pursuing that versus looking to information about how do you do this better.
Yeah, that's true. And yet, oftentimes I hear people say, even today, I read a comment somewhere about someone had given up. If you just give up processed foods, you'll lose weight. Well, for a lot of people, that really is true. But in that weight loss realm, it's usually about more than that. And people do really want to go to a fad diet.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes do you see people who are asking for prayers for something, and then at the same time they're munching on a Big Mac or drinking a soda or something?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, you see people asking for prayers for things and they're just right in front of you. They're doing things that's causing your problem, And it's hard because it's hard to give people unsolicited advice. So I think the best thing we can do is just try to spread this education.
Yes, I agree. And be a good example, not an arrogant example, but a good example. And sometimes people notice, sometimes they don't. And I don't think we should be putting ourselves up on a pedestal either for people to say, hey, look at what she does. But you see the same kinds of problems that I do, and you're doing something about it. Tell us a little bit about your practice and what you do within your practice.
Yeah, thanks. So I do some one-on-one counseling. I've got a website where I've got an option for that. But what I really love doing is teaching small group classes with church groups, or I've done this before just with groups of friends. And what I would really love to see happen is for Christians who care about this and who've benefited from changing their diet, for them to be able to take this information and go teach it to their friends. And this was
Yeah.
a lot of the feedback I got at the conference that I was at, the conference you put on last August that I was at, was people told me, I want to teach a class like this for my friends, but I don't have the time or the resources necessarily to go create all these course materials for myself. So one of the things I finished recently is creating course materials that Christians can get off my website and then use to go teach their own class. And I've tried to make that as comprehensive as possible. So it's as easy. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to have a ton of time to prepare. You can just go teach your friends, because that's really the organic way that this information gets spread, is not someone like you or me trying to teach everybody, but
Right.
people going and telling their friends about it. And they get that from people they know and they trust. Yeah, so I'm working on that. And I'm also working on a book right now.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Give us a clue.
Well, very similar to my course materials, which I also have that course available as an e-course if someone wants to just go take that themselves. So very similar material that I have in my e-course, in my course facilitation materials, and in my book is I really just want Christians to have a resource that if they're thinking about, how can I eat better for a health problem I have, or how can I eat better for my children, my family, to keep them healthy? How do I wade through all this confusing, contradictory, constantly changing information out there that the world gives us? How do I wade through that with my biblical worldview and figure out what's healthy meat, what's healthy dairy, what are healthy fruits and grains, and all of this? And so I'm really just trying to make a resource that is based on a biblical worldview, on science, on an ancestral perspective. And informally, I've got Joel Salatin writing the foreword for that too. So
Oh,
I'm
good.
excited. It will
That's
be
wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. To you and I both, it seems all of this seems somewhat intuitive. Like we ought to be able to just read, like the book of Leviticus, read the food laws and even the farming laws. And we call them laws, but really they're instructions.
Mm.
That's one thing. I'm reading Hope Egan's book, and you would have met Hope last April. No. Anyway, and she's talking about the meats and clean meats versus unclean meats, but she makes some really good points just about how we've come so far away from God's instruction book. And for instance, in farming, say you're drinking a glass of milk that's coming from a conventional farm, and the animals are not even being raised in a natural, God-given way. And then we're consuming that meat, we're consuming that milk, we're consuming that product. Should we expect the proper outcome when we're consuming those kinds of foods?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that makes a big difference. And it's hard to wade through all that, because so much of what we get is just what we see in marketing, or even a lot of information on social media. And it wouldn't necessarily help you understand what is a good way to raise a cow and what is good milk. That can be difficult to figure out.
Mm-hmm. It can be. So where do you start with teaching people about, for instance, let's start with just food in general. What is your first go-to point?
Yeah, I love looking at it from what's our foundation, right? Because there's order to this. It's not chaotic. And we should be able to come up with some kind of framework that helps us determine, because I don't want to just tell people a bunch of specific instructions, like eat this, not this, buy this kind of meat, not this kind of meat. I want people to know for themselves, how do I distinguish for myself what is good and not good food? And so
that's confusing.
Yes. The framework I use is, we need to understand that God's creation is good and he made his creation well, but he's also given us dominion over it. And that's super important, because sometimes we'll hear these kind of trite things like, the more natural, the better. And in a lot of cases that's true, but there's nuance to that. When we have dominion over creation, that means We can, for example, we can raise cows for milk. You know, a lot of people will tell you, you're not an animal. You shouldn't be drinking milk after infancy. Well, we're not animals. God created us as humans, set apart from animals with dominion. And dominion also means that we can take God's creation and we can work it and even improve upon it. And that leads us to understanding the benefit of traditional preparation methods, for example, that, you know, we shouldn't just be eating raw grains, for example, we should be cooking them and fermenting them. So I think when we have that from that foundation of God's creation is good, our bodies are good, but what does good dominion over that look like? I think from that we can figure out, for the most part, what is good and what is helpful and what's not helpful.
Yeah, that's right. And you've heard Joel talk about, does God care? He preached that first sermon for us back in August of 2022, I guess.
Yep. Yeah. The first year I was there.
Yeah. And so you heard that, and we all heard that. I thought that was such a good message. But how do we help Christians even ask that question? That's a toughie for me. I get frustrated, as we've already mentioned, at the thought of people needing prayers, asking for prayers, and it never seems like the right thing. I want them, and how do we help them to ask the right questions, such as, okay, you had blood sugar regulation issues. Well, is that necessarily strictly a medical problem? How do we help people to take a look at their diets and lifestyle, that may be the very thing causing their problems? And so to me, it's difficult to know how we can reach people. What are some things that you do, some approaches that you take?
You know, I think it's really helpful to talk about how this has benefited us. Stories are very impactful. And I love hearing other people's stories that people share with me on social media. I love trying to share those, because that's really how people are going to realize, oh, wow, someone else dealt with the same problem. But by changing their diet, they were able to improve this. You know, otherwise, what we see in the world is that we have all this bad diet advice. And so it's not a surprise that most people trying to eat healthier, it doesn't make much difference for them, right? If sometimes it's even counterproductive. And so we can't blame people for not realizing that diet makes a big impact, because they see very few examples of people changing their diet and really improving their health from that. So the more we can show people, no, I've actually taken this different approach and it actually did make a difference, that's what's going to make people realize they can do the same thing.
I think that's very wise. And I hadn't thought about that particular thing, but the more that we put stories out there of people being able to overcome serious health issues just with changing their diet, that speaks volumes. How did you overcome first your blood sugar issue?
I think that was getting more fat in my diet. And that's the thing I would recommend for anyone with blood sugar issues. If your blood sugar is getting low, you're probably just not eating enough fat. Of course, we want to be eating good fat. That's huge. But at the same time, I started adopting a low FODMAP diet for my digestive issues. I was experimenting with a lot of different things at the time. But somehow in the midst of all of that, it all cleared up pretty quickly.
Can you explain what a low FODMAP diet is for those who don't know?
Yeah, that's good. So FODMAPs, it's an acronym for names of several different types of sugars that ferment easily. Is that correct? From your understanding? And there are types of sugars that can contribute to digestive issues. So a low FODMAP diet cuts out foods that are high in these specific type of sugars. So it's going to be things like garlic and apples. And some of them, they're not super intuitive what all would go on this list, but it's one thing that a lot of people have experienced benefits with digestive problems by temporarily adopting a low FODMAP diet.
Okay. Yeah. I've known a lot of people who have overcome a lot of serious issues using the low FODMAP diet, and others. And of course, then you learn to understand why it is that some of these foods do cause digestive issues. Now, garlic, I think, should never cause any issues. It's wonderful, delicious, and good for us.
Did I get that wrong? Is that not on the list?
No, no, no. It's a frustrating thing to me. And I have a friend from high school who cannot handle garlic at all. And I tell her, well, when you come and eat at my house, I just have to make an entirely different pot of soup or something for you because garlic is so good. But especially those sugars and starches that are so problematic. And now, of course, you understand why. And maybe you want to elaborate on that.
Yeah. And I eat all those foods now. So I think that is so super important to understand the why, because it doesn't mean apples or garlic are unhealthy. Tons of benefits, those kinds of foods, like you said. It's that in this specific situation, they're not helping us heal. So it's so important to understand the nuance of why we do certain things. And it's not like everything can be categorized into healthy or unhealthy.
Yeah.
Because sometimes that's the simplistic way of that we go about nutrition.
Yeah. And Carmen's also saying, what? Not garlic. And garlic is tough. But we've caused so much damage, in my opinion, to our guts with poor quality fake food, replacing nutrient dense foods with processed foods, and then the pharmaceuticals that we're putting into our bodies, especially. And that's specifically why we have these issues, I believe 100%. Pharmaceuticals are a big input there too. So when you have gut damage, when you've kind of eaten away at the villi and created holes in the gut, then many of these foods that are common are going to be problematic. So I'm actually trying to pull one up right now. Bread, the staff of life. And I can't even imagine that at any point in time prior to the modern world that bread would have been an issue. But it is now for a lot of people like yourself. And it has been for a couple of members of my own family too. And yet now that you've healed and we've healed, we can enjoy a beautiful loaf of bread or a slice of bread, but it needs to be what type of bread? There are some criteria for that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So fermented is super important. That's what a sourdough starter does. That's what real sourdough bread is. And yeah, I love talking about bread because it's such a hot topic, but it's so easy to talk about biblically as well.
Yeah. It bothers me to think that some people go completely without any food group that God gave us, but especially that particular food, because so many biblical analogies and lessons are taught using bread as a subject, as the illustration. Now, my favorite way to eat bread is toasted with as much butter on the surface, raw butter preferably, as the thickness of the bread. What are your thoughts on how people used to use bread biblically, scripturally? What do you see versus how we're consuming bread now?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll be honest. I was one of the people who avoided bread for a long time, and it has been so cool getting back to the place of realizing I can eat this, and I actually feel really good eating this. The bread we usually have today is so different than what, for example, we would see in the Bible. So we know that most bread in the Bible was leavened, it was fermented. The whole point of Passover being unleavened bread is that was unusual. It was naturally leavened, and today we have all these artificial leavening agents. So we have artificial dough conditioners, artificial sweeteners and flavors and oils and everything that goes into bread. So most people, when they cut out bread, of course, they're going to feel better if they're not eating the stuff from the grocery store. But it's so sad to be missing out on something that can be so good just because they think that the bread itself is actually the issue. So yeah, I buy unbleached, unbromated, unfortified organic flour. I make my own bread with my sourdough starter. Really, any wheat I eat now, I try to ferment it with my sourdough starter. You can make a lot more with sourdough than just bread, of course.
Yeah.
Do so much better with that.
Yeah. And then we, of course, want the grains to be organic, free of the pesticides that are so prevalent in conventional grains. And I prefer to use ancient grains like spelt, emmer, einkorn. Tomorrow we have somebody coming over from Sicily, and we're going to make pasta together with organic durum semolina. So definitely organic and old-fashioned as much as possible. Some of those dough conditioners that I used to use when I was learning to make bread 30 years ago, they're very high in gluten and starches. That's why they help to make bread rise. But looking also just at the biblical diet, here's a good example of a typical meal that Jesus might have eaten. Now, we've got fish. Let me see if I can make it a little bit larger for me. There's bread there, and it's a flat bread, but it's a fermented bread. And then there are pistachios and grapes and things like that, and olive oil in the bottle. And Jesus drank wine. So a typical, I think probably more of a peasant meal in Jesus' day would have consisted of something like this. We don't know exactly what people ate from day to day, but something like this. And to me, that looks like a delicious meal, except for I don't see any butter on the table. And for me, that would be problematic. But Jesus ate meat. Jesus ate fish. Jesus ate a variety of meats. So let's talk a little bit about that. Oh, I didn't mean to put that up yet, but there's another example of good meat that Jesus ate. What is your perspective on eating meat?
Yeah, I love talking about this topic because this is so hot today, obviously. And there's plenty of people trying to condemn meat eating from a biblical perspective.
Yep.
But there's so much we could say about this if we're really looking at a good biblical interpretation of this topic. So one of the starting points I like to talk about with this is all throughout the Bible and in God's creation, we see this reality that death is required for there to be life. And, we see that with soil. We see that in Passover. We see that even from the Garden of Eden all the way to Revelation, this overarching story of God's salvation. And ultimately, we see this story with Jesus' death on the cross.
Yes, exactly.
But how this applies to our diet is when we look at the micronutrients in meat, the fatty acids in meat, the amino acids in meat, the fat and the protein, it's pretty clear that this is necessary for a healthy diet. And if we are going to try to avoid eating meat, the only thing that's going to happen is we're going to end up finding death some way or another, whether it's through the slow decline of our health, which is very, very common with vegetarian and vegan diets, or unintentional deaths we just don't see. People don't want a dead animal on their plate, and I understand that. That is a reality of the fall. But what we don't see is all the small animals that die, even just in plant food production. And if you really want the least animals to die for your meal, probably the best thing you can do is eat large animals, which is going to be things like ruminants, cows, which are great. Yes. And, if there was any righteousness in not eating meat, we would see that in Jesus. And just like you've said, we know he ate meat. The Bible very clearly talks about him eating fish, and there's no reason to think he didn't eat all kinds of other meats. People will use the Garden of Eden and say, well, the Garden of Eden was a vegan diet, but there's no way we are supposed to be trying to replicate that today in our fallen world. That was such a fundamentally different place than our world is today. And if you're going to say humans shouldn't eat meat because of the Garden of Eden, I mean, you would have to say that same thing about lions and all kinds of other predators. And it just does not hold up logically at all. People will talk about the story of Daniel and how he ate this vegetable diet and was strong and healthy. But the whole point of that story is that God kept him and his friends healthy despite their diet. No one expected that.
No, I mean, I've always thought that, but in this push to avoid eating meat from a Christian perspective, people will bring up Daniel as, well, look at Daniel and his 3 friends. And they're totally missing, 2 points. But I do think that that's the biggest point is God took care of them. And the other thing is that that's not how they were brought up. They had a very solid foundation all of their life, eating eating things actually probably a lot like this.
Yeah.
Beautiful things. The organ meat, the flesh meat, and the herbs that God gave us as well. And what do you know? There's garlic. There we go with garlic again. And I'm going to move to another spot because I need to plug in. Anyway, you just cannot justify from a biblical perspective a vegan diet. I don't think you can justify a vegetarian diet either. When you look at Jesus' life, you see him. Well, the Passover it's lamb, right? The Passover feast was lamb. The heavenly angels were the heavenly visitors that Abram and Sarai served were given the fatted calf along with birds and whey. Um, every celebration was around a table filled with meat. So I agree 100% with you. I want people to realize that that Garden of Eden diet was a temporary diet at a time when people were absolutely perfect. They weren't toxic. They lived in a very clean environment. And even within a fallen world, they were much closer to perfection. So after the fall, we need meat. Yeah. But we need a variety of meat and not just the hamburger or the steak. So, do you encourage people to consume organ meats?
Yes, absolutely. And it's really this modern concept that we can even just get muscle meat and nothing else.
Yeah.
If you're, which we should be concerned about animal welfare and conservation. And if we're going to do that, that means we should be using the whole animal well.
Yeah.
And today, so many organ meats just go to waste. Maybe at best, they're getting turned into dog food, but these are by far the most nutritious parts of the animal. And when you really get into the science of all the micronutrients you're trying to balance and all the different amino acids you're trying to balance, it's pretty clear that we need to be eating a lot of collagen, which is coming from the bones and these tough pieces of meat, and that we need to be eating the organs like the liver and heart and everything. And when we do that, we're going to really get a well-balanced diet from the whole animal.
Yeah, and it also kind of makes the sacrifice of that animal be more appreciated, more valued, and more worthy of slaughter because you're not throwing good parts away. In Dr. Price's research, as I know you're familiar with, it seemed that the people he studied always revered the organ meats above and beyond anything else. And if we look in the world of nature, of carnivores, they consume the contents of the stomach and the organs before they eat the flesh meat. So I think it's really important. Do you have people sometimes really give you a hard time about eating meat in general, or just not understanding?
Oh yeah. It's even if people are not trying to be vegan or vegetarian, it's just so hard for people if all they've heard before is this conventional narrative and they've seen people saying, I'm going to go vegetarian. It is really hard for people to get their minds around the idea that you really can eat meat, a good quantity of it, and feel no guilt about that. And red meat too, all the clean. You mentioned earlier the Levitical instructions. I like that. And there's a whole lot that could be said about that. But the very first animals that were given to God's people as clean animals were ruminants, which is red meat. There's no way that could be the case if all these things we hear about red meat today, that it causes diabetes and cancer and whatever. If that were true, there's no way this would have been the first thing God gave to his people and said, this is what you should eat. We know that they raised goats, they raised sheep, they probably ate a lot of red meat. And that can be hard for people to wrap their minds around. But I love helping people see that they really don't need to feel guilty about that at all.
Yeah, I agree. And then it's important that we understand again that we must be raising our foods correctly. If you have 2 pennies to rub together and that's it, And you simply cannot go to a farm and buy half a steer or a quarter of a steer or a pound of grass-fed, grass-finished ground beef. Then conventional beef is better than no beef at all or no meat at all. But God gave us instructions about how to raise our food as well, how to harvest our food. And aside from, say, deer that graze out in the wild, how do you instruct people about how animals should be raised that they're going to consume for themselves and their families?
Yeah. Well, something else we can learn from those Levitical dietary laws is that the diet of our food matters. That's really what distinguishes all the clean and unclean animals, is what they ate. And today, I think we have bigger issues, or at least different issues, than a pig who might have a parasite. Today, our issue is that most all of the meat we're eating is coming from these large factory farms where they're eating really unnatural diets. And that affects us when we eat those animals.
It really does. And in what ways? Let's talk about fatty acid composition, for instance.
Yes. So I am such a big believer that we need to be limiting our polyunsaturated fats. This is one of the biggest problems with our health today. And of course, most of those are coming just from the vegetable oils. But when you have a pig or a chicken raised on an unnatural diet, it is going to be a lot higher in those polyunsaturated fats.
But aren't they good for us? That's what we're always told.
Yes, they're essential, right? But you get more than enough of those, even from a highly saturated fat like butter. That's the thing I tell people all the time. Don't worry about trying to get extra polyunsaturated fats. You get more than enough, even from a steak. And so that's one of the biggest. That's probably my biggest concern with conventional meat, is going to be the extra polyunsaturated fats, especially with pork and chicken. It doesn't make as big of a difference with beef, but I prioritize my pork and my chicken first of all, and finding high quality.
Yeah, and we'll talk about clean and unclean meat in another episode. But for now, even just the fact that the fat carries a lot of toxins. So on a conventional farm, there is going to be a very clear and present toxic load within that animal because they're being fed genetically modified, heavily sprayed grains. That goes into the meat, and specifically it's stored in the fat. We don't believe in low-fat diets, do we?
No.
Yeah, we've already touched on that. So it is important that the meat be clean. We used to live up in apple country, in orchard country in Pennsylvania, and it always concerned me that even eating wild game, deer specifically, that were eating in the orchards, that they would also carry a toxic load, but it's not going to be the same at all as an animal in confinement that's just being fed genetically modified grains and sprayed grains. And I always like to remind people too about labels that grass-fed, all cattle are grass-fed. So it doesn't actually mean much of anything. Grass-fed, grass-finished, and organically raised are the important factors to avoid the toxins and to get the most nutrients. And then dairy, is that something you had a problem with at one time?
There's a lot of different times where I've tried cutting out dairy, because you hear so many recommendations. Try cutting out dairy for this digestive problem, that digestive problem. And there were times where it seemed to help my acne or something like that. But learning about high quality dairy has made all the difference for me. Yeah. So now I'm getting raw milk. I'm getting yogurt I'm so excited about this. Right now I'm living in a little camper on my in-laws farm while my husband's deployed. And they have milk cows, and they milk them by hand, and they put it in glass. And so we're just getting all our raw milk, like the day it's been milked, and making yogurt. And
that is wonderful.
So we're eating a lot of that. And I'm feeling the best I ever have. There's no reason I need to cut it out.
Yeah. It's the raw milk from grass-fed, naturally raised, pastured animals that tastes the best and has the best nutrition the highest nutrient profile of anything else. And there's that dog again. The truck went by. Anyway, we need the nutrient. Hey, buddy, come here. Come here, bud. Hopefully next week he'll be in a new home. He follows me everywhere, so I can't seem to get rid of him. Anyway, I see God's people making cheese, curds and whey cheese. It might just be letting your raw milk sour, which it sours instead of putrefies. So I strongly encourage people to consume also raw dairy. I'm not sure if you were present when we did the raw milk challenge.
Yes.
You were. So you saw that. Did you get to taste any of the milks that I had brought along?
No.
Oh, it was so much fun. So much fun because we had everything from camel to water buffalo, and water buffalo is my favorite by far.
Wow.
But clearly I have another dog trying to play. Okay. Too many dogs, too many cats. Anyway, what do you see in terms of scripturally people consuming milk or the benefits of dairy products?
Well, the promised land is called the land of milk and honey, right?
I was hoping you'd say that. Yeah.
Anything in the Bible that was used as a sacrifice, that was specifically given to God's people like that, we have to assume that somehow that can be a good food.
Yeah.
And we need to be really careful about writing anything like that off, over just lumping the whole thing together and saying it's not healthy.
Right. And the idea that just because we're adults that we shouldn't be consuming dairy, or that we shouldn't be consuming dairy products from another animal. That's just a totally misguided thought, in my opinion. Other animals do drink the milk when possible. Yeah. When I used to milk my cow out in the barn, the cats were always right there, ready and willing. I give raw milk to my dogs and my cats. But we're also the only creature that we're made in God's image. And you've said that. I've heard you say that several times, or something like that. We are made in God's image. We're not an animal. We are, I don't even like to use the word human sometimes. We are mankind. We are made in God's image. And that's a fantastic thing. That includes the brains and the hands to be able to do things that animals cannot do. So we're also the only animals that build houses and drive cars. So maybe we shouldn't do that either. Obviously we should. It's a good thing. So I just want people to be able to think that through a little more clearly. What else do you do in your practice then? Do you have your clients do food diaries to track?
I have before. I haven't recently, but I do think that actually is a helpful tool, especially if someone is just getting started, I think, because it's easy to not realize what you're actually eating. And what I will do sometimes is I'll ask people, okay, tell me what you ate for breakfast this morning and lunch tomorrow. And if it was totally unusual, tell me, but usually that's a pretty good representation of what they're eating. And one of the interesting things I'll discover is people tell me all the time, oh, I don't eat vegetable oils. I cook with olive oil. And then I say, okay, tell me what you ate. Okay, well, I had these corn chips last night for dinner, and I'm having this protein bar for lunch. And I go look up the ingredients.
Oh, man.
So I really like trying to educate people on, it is hard to avoid vegetable oils, but it is really worth it if you can start reading ingredients. And so, yeah, overall, it can be really helpful, I think, for people to just somehow sit down and figure out what they're really eating. Because a lot of people you don't really know, or you assume you're doing a lot better than you really are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you don't always see the effect within a few minutes or even an hour. You might see a negative effect or a positive effect 10, 12, 24 hours later. So I think it helps to have a food diary. I did that a couple of times, but years ago, and it helped me considerably to understand how what I was eating affected. Actually, it helped me to understand I needed to go off gluten for a while until I healed my gut.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that can be an effective tool. Do you have some other means that you recommend to people to help identify both problem areas with foods as well as how different foods are having a beneficial effect?
That's a good question. One of the things I like to tell people to do first of all is just start reading the ingredients on everything. Everything. Don't assume anything is just one ingredient or something, or that you know it's in it. Start reading the ingredients on everything, and then I will, work through those things with people and try to identify what of the ingredients in here things are eating might be causing your problems. I think that is so true what you said, that sometimes the effect is going to be seen way down the road. So I spent about 15 years trying to clear up my acne. That was a big problem for me. And it wasn't until I completely cut out vegetable oils that my skin completely cleared up for the first time. And now if I eat one thing, like, oh, I didn't realize those artichoke hearts were soaked in sunflower oil. I know if I ate something that had vegetable oils in it, because I will break out, and it'll take a couple weeks for my skin to clear. So it was really hard to figure out that was the problem, because it wasn't, when I had that all the time, I couldn't tell what was causing the problem. But now that I've cut it down, I can really, really tell.
Yeah. It took me quite a while to realize too that eating gluten at the time that my gut was damaged from, I never did a lot of pharmaceuticals, but some. And I just hadn't recognized that there was actually gut damage until I started to pay close attention. And the thing I noticed was that my hair would come out.
Oh, wow.
When I was eating gluten, within a few days, within hours, my head would be itching.
Wow.
And then within days, it would start to come out. Now, I read that typically it might take 3 months, but it would be days for me. And I'd be pulling out. I noticed that my hair was getting thin. Now I'm okay as long as I'm just eating soaked or sprouted or fermented grains, particularly sourdough or a long fermented bread. So that's really important. God gave us the tools to prepare our foods, in addition to giving us instructions for what foods we should be eating. So the fermentation with sourdough bread is really important, isn't it?
Yeah.
And our friend Robert asked about where we can get good grains, and of course there's To Your Health sprouted flour it's already sprouted, so that has neutralized the very aggravating factors in the grain in the same way that fermentation does. But I think fermentation does an even better or more complete job, possibly. And sometimes I do sprouted and fermented.
Nice.
You ever play around with any of that?
Yeah. I haven't done sprouted grains in a while. I have bought those before, sprouted rice and things like that.
Yeah.
Sprouted corn. I have been able to find sprouted corn chips before, which is really cool. But any nuts, seeds, grains I eat, I'm always trying to prepare those somehow, whether it's fermenting them, soaking rice for a long time with some kind of acid, buying nixtamalized corn, which is the corn that's been soaked in lime, not lime juice, but the base. That's, the traditional preparation method of corn. My goal is really any nuts, seeds, grains I'm eating, that they're going to be prepared like that somehow.
Yeah, mine as well. But we definitely need to stay away in the fat realm from the seed oils, which they're far more damaging than eating the seed unsprouted. But those seed and the vegetable oils that you mentioned are really seed oils, and they're all very toxic. What are the traditional fats and the benefits of traditional fats? I'm kind of hopping around. I should have stuck on the fat idea and finished it out.
We're covering a lot of good stuff.
We are.
Yeah, most people are on board with saying natural is better, right? And they don't realize that the most unnatural thing we're eating, or at least in any significant quantity, is vegetable oils. Very unnatural. Yes, they come from the seed, but the problem is we're getting them in these massive quantities that you never would be able to get naturally by just pressing a corn kernel, for example. And a lot of them are acutely toxic when they're first extracted, and they have to go through some major processing to make them not acutely toxic. I think they're still pretty
canola oil, for instance, rapeseed oil is toxic straight
Mhm.
out of the seed.
Yeah, and cottonseed oil, I believe too. Yeah, because that didn't used to ever be eaten.
Right.
Yeah, so the good fats would be what I really like to just call natural fats, but this is going to be animal fats. My main cooking fat is rendered tallow or butter. Lard can be a good option. Yeah, yeah. Look at all that solid fat on top, and when it's solid like that, that means it's highly saturated, which is a good.
Yes.
That's a
And
good.
that in Jewish tradition would be called schmaltz.
Mm-hmm.
I make chicken liver pate with that, but you can cook with it. So it's like tallow, except for it comes from poultry instead of beef or lamb. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, olive oil, we mentioned that too.
Mhm.
People will get confused sometimes because they go, well, isn't that a vegetable oil? And it's terrible that gets called a veg. It's terrible that anything gets called a vegetable oil because there's no such thing.
Yeah.
No oils come from vegetables. Olive
Right.
oil is the fruit oil. And so is avocado oil, coconut oil. So those ones are good too.
Yes. They're very good. In fact, coconut oil, I've read, is the most consumed oil traditionally anywhere in the world. I have a hard time believing it's not butter or tallow or even lard, uh,
Interesting.
but people have become so poisoned against the idea of consuming the saturated fats. Now, schmaltz and olive oil both are also pretty high in monounsaturated fats, which are good for our bodies as
Mhm.
well. So, what do you notice in your body when you started to consume more fats? You mentioned the blood sugar regulation. Did it help with acne problems as well, or anything?
Well, switching out the vegetable oils for that for sure.
Yeah,
But yes, I think overall getting enough fat just seems like my skin is good, my nails are good, I have good energy, and seems like my hormones are good. That's super important for
yeah.
hormones. I just feel good overall.
For fertility and pregnancy, also, those fats are super important. Did you find anything specifically in regards to having children, to having babies that helped you with your fertility and your pregnancies?
I was doing a lot of these things by the time I got pregnant with my first. I was eating lots of meat. I was eating organ meats. I was avoiding vegetable oils, trying to get traditionally prepared grains, like everything we talked about. I was doing that by the time I got pregnant with my first,
Okay.
two now. But so it's hard to say what exactly caused what. But I mean, I had a pretty easy pregnancy. I didn't have a lot of nausea. I never had any swelling or blood pressure or blood sugar issues.
Yeah.
So many things that, so many people struggle with: postpartum depression, hair loss, skin problems. I didn't have any of that.
Yeah.
And my
Good.
baby seemed healthy, and they love all these foods I want them to eat. They love them. They even love organ meats. Will
Good.
they love, even my 6-month-old baby, they love liver and all kinds of stuff.
That's wonderful. What were their first foods?
It was, I don't always keep track real well, but steak, organ meats, eggs, yogurt,
Yeah.
fruits. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wonderful. But not the baby cereals.
No, I've never bought this.
Thank you. No, those are not, I don't ever recommend them. Babies don't even produce the digestive enzymes until at least a year old
Yeah.
to process the carbohydrates from grains. So we shouldn't be giving those. But how wonderful that your kids are learning how to enjoy the organ meats, especially, and all of those other beautiful foods. And in my own pregnancies, there was an absolute night and day difference between pre higher animal input and higher fat intake.
Oh, wow.
Just when I thought I was doing the right thing, eating mostly vegetables, and I guess I drank raw milk through a couple of them. But yeah, I can compare in my pregnancies to say that definitely eating like you did through your pregnancies made a huge impact on how I felt as well. So instead of feeling like a worn out dish rag and having to peel me off the couch, I was up and doing chores and teaching kids how to read and doing the dishes and all that stuff. It's a huge difference. And that's something I hope that any women of childbearing age will hear and take in, because it's really critical for the development of the baby as well as how we feel. So what's up next for you? What are you working on now? You're working on a book.
Mhm. Yes, I am that is my big project in my free time right now. I'm really looking forward to your conference in April of next year. I've got a couple other conferences I'm planning to go to as well next year. So I'll be very excited for next summer. I'll be getting to go to some good conferences.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's always a lot of fun. I do a lot of traveling to conferences during the summer months, but there's lots to learn. So many neat organizations out there that are doing wonderful things. So it's really good to get out and learn. Kat, where can people find you then on social media, or if they want to book an appointment with you or learn more about your e-course?
Oh, thanks for asking. Yeah, my website is eatbyfaith.online, not .com, eatbyfaith.online. And then I'm most active on Instagram. And on Instagram, I'm eatbyfaith_biblical health. So
Yeah, I have to say, I really like what you put out on Instagram.
thank you.
I'm frequently going, yes, Kat. Oh, that's so interesting. You do a very good job with all of that information. So I recommend people that you follow Kat as well on Instagram, because you do a great job of informing people.
Oh, I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, very engaging as well. So, well, we've run out of time, so we're going to wrap up now, and we're going to say goodbye to doggies eating bones, which is something they should be doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we'll say goodbye for now, but Kat, I'd love to have you back on another time to go on and talk about some other things. But for now, we are very grateful for your time. The time flew by, and we have good conversations. This was wonderful. So of course it flew by. But we'll say goodbye for now, and we'll keep all of you posted on what's coming up next. Actually, I wish Aaron could tell me what's coming up next, because I forgot to check. I can probably check real quickly, but we do need to put up a schedule of what we have. We're booked for the next couple of months. So we have some interesting topics coming up. And well, we'll just see where we go. But Kat, we'll see you soon, I hope. And we're definitely looking forward to having you come and speak again at our event. And hopefully I'll get to actually spend more time with you, because I feel like I don't get to spend enough time with you and a couple of others. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next week. So, all right. Bye-bye.
Bye.